Welcome back to Wages and Employment at Wilfrid Laurier University. Today we're going to look at what happens when we introduce childcare subsidies to our basic labor supply model. For reference, you should pair this video with readings in Chapter 3 of your textbook. I think it's worth starting with a bit of history. When the first edition of your textbook was being written, the debate over childcare and the role of government was still recent, at least among economists. Childcare was recognized as an important part of the infrastructure needed to support women's entry to the labor market, as they were, and most often continue to be, the primary caregivers of children. But in the 1970s, this was a fairly new idea in policy circles, and certainly not widely agreed upon. Today, as more women are working and more men are taking on the job of parenting, childcare has become much more salient to the average voter. But we haven't seen much progress policy-wise. Part of the policy challenge here is that childcare, like education, falls in the provincial jurisdiction. The federal government can offer tax deductions or credits, but they are quite limited in that regard. Most other options require agreements with the provinces, but we will leave that challenge for another course. And here, we will focus on how kids alter our budget constraints, how childcare costs will alter things, and what childcare subsidies can do to support labor market activity. We model childcare as a fixed cost of work. This means the cost does not vary with how many hours you work each day. So, for example, many centers require you to pay for the entire month, or sometimes the day, even if you only use part of it, to cover the staffing costs and simply hold the spot that they could give to the next person on the wait list. I was looking at some 2018 numbers for Kitchener, which suggested the median rate for infants was nearly $1,500 per month. And for toddlers, it was just over $1,100 per month. Kids do get cheaper. When they start at school and just need some childcare before and after school in the Waterloo region, it costs $26 per day. As a benchmark, if you worked at a minimum wage job full-time in Ontario, you would earn about $2,000 per month. So I don't think of infant care as easily affordable. We're going to start here with our constrained utility maximization problem. The person is offered a wage rate W1 in the market and has non-labor income YN1 and is willing to work H1 hours with L1 hours of leisure time. And then they decide to have kids. What happens? Well, they realize that if they spend even a minute at work, they have to pay daycare fees, D, per day. Since this doesn't depend on whether they work 1 second or 8 hours, this is like a parallel shift in their constraint by the size of the fee. But if they don't work at all, not a single second, they can avoid those daycare fees. They won't have any earnings, of course, but they can consume from their non-labor income at this point here, where leisure is equal to the time endowment. I'll emphasize the obvious point that caring for a newborn baby full-time is not leisure. If you don't already have kids, you should be prepared for that. Now, how might this affect labor supply? Let's start by looking at what happens to their reservation wages. Consider first your world without kids. So the person had chosen the bundle A on our gray potential income constraint. The reservation wage is that wage where they would be just indifferent between working or not, which is the slope of the indifference curve here, where leisure is equal to the time endowment, where you can imagine being just indifferent between not working and working a single second. But then there's kids. Now think about the comparison between not working and working at all. What wage rate is needed to be indifferent? This first reservation wage line is no longer relevant. Instead, you have to think about going from this blue dot and then moving to a constraint that starts where our blue constraint starts. That is represented by our green dashed line entered here, which pivots up until we find a point where the person is indifferent between working and not. The obvious point here is that their reservation wage is quite high after having kids, and for some people, that is going to take them out of the labor force entirely. So suppose the government decides to step in and offer some subsidies. Here, this has the simple effect of reducing our daycare cost D by the amount of the subsidy, S, effectively moving up that part of the potential income constraint that had been pushed down when we had kids. For this individual, even though they still have the option of avoiding daycare fees by not working, they would stay in the labor force if the subsidy the daycare fees. This has a clear income effect. But so does a subsidy. Compare their choice at B. They would work less with the subsidy given the income effect associated with the transfer. Now this wraps up our discussion of income support programs in this chapter. Next time, we will start thinking a bit bigger and study more dynamic decisions made over our lifetime.